Raymond Quiet Ray Marshall, a reclusive Vietnam hero, lives humbly in rural Arkansas until thieves ransack his trailer, stealing a sacred black and silver Delta patch, earned in blood during a covert 1978 mission. The theft rekindles old memories and stirs a forgotten brotherhood. As the town whispers his legend, veterans rally, led by Colonel Divers, to hunt the patch across state lines. Who stole it? Why, will Ray reclaim his past, or will the ghosts of his service stay buried? The search intensifies, and a community awakens to honor a hero they never truly knew. Support our channel to keep stories of unsung heroes like Ray Marshall alive. Subscribe, share, and join our community to honor veterans' legacies. Your support fuels these tales of courage and brotherhood. Don't miss out. Visit our channel and help us amplify voices that deserve to be heard. Under the heavy shade of ancient oaks, Raymond Ray Marshall's trailer sat like a relic of a bygone era. Its aluminum siding dented and peeling, kissed by years of Arkansas sun and rain. The 78-year-old man lived on the fringes of a small rural town, where the county road twisted past a feed store and a gas station so rusted it hadn't pumped fuel since the mid-90s. To the townsfolk, he was Quiet Ray, not a name spoken with malice, but one earned through his sparse words and unassuming presence. Ray didn't chase conversation or clamor for attention. He was a man who spoke only when the moment demanded it, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much to waste breath on trivialities. His mornings were as predictable as the sunrise, a 2-mile walk to Jake's Diner, where he'd sip a small black coffee and skim the local paper, its headlines often too small for the world he'd once known. On his way back, he'd stop by Mrs. Penner's place, an 84-year-old widow with a bum hip, to let her yappy terrier out and refill its water bowl. That was Ray, steady, reliable, a man who moved through life like a metronome, ticking quietly in the background. At the VA clinic, where he volunteered twice a week, Ray was an enigma to the younger veterans. He didn't swagger like the old Marines or dive into heated debates like the Navy guys. But when a soldier walked in, trembling from nightmares that clung like damp rot, or sat too long staring at their hands, Ray would pull up a chair. He'd sit there silent, his presence a quiet anchor in a storm no one else could see. No words, no grand gestures, just a stillness that said, "I've been there, and I'm here now." It was enough. His trailer, though modest from the outside, held a different story within its walls. A shadow box hung prominently, its contents a mosaic of a life few knew. Faded ribbons, a bronze star tucked humbly in the corner, and at the center a black and silver patch, gleaming like a talisman. Below it, a folded American flag rested under glass, a note in delicate script pinned beside it. To Ray, the strongest man I ever knew. Love, Ellie. His wife Ellie had been gone since 2007, but her words still lived in that trailer, as did Ray, who'd called it home since 1982. Every item he owned carried weight: a battered Zippo lighter etched with Da Nang 68 in, a photograph of 5 men in jungle fatigues, their faces mud-streaked and arms slung over each other's shoulders, frozen in a moment no one spoke of. These were the relics of Sergeant First Class Raymond Marshall, a man who'd fought in Vietnam, endured 2 tours in Cambodia, and then slipped into the shadows of covert Cold War missions, operations so clandestine they never made the papers, deployments that offered no parades or promises of return. Ray didn't talk about those days, not to the diner regulars or the VA staff. He'd seen enough fire to crave silence, and for 40 years he'd built a life on that quiet, carrying his burdens with a grace that asked for no applause. But that peace shattered one night. Ray's walk home from town was a ritual, each step familiar, the crunch of gravel under his boots, a rhythm he'd known for decades. Yet as his trailer came into view, a prickle of unease stirred in his chest. Not fear, but the old instinct, sharp and honed from 68, whispering that something was wrong. The screen door hung crooked, its bottom hinge snapped like a broken bone. The main door, once a pale green, now chipped to gray, sat ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling out. His gut tightened, not with panic, but with the cold clarity of a man who'd walked into ambushes before. He didn't call out or reach for his phone. His boots moved deliberately, each step measured on the dry earth until he reached the stoop. The wood creaked under his weight, a small betrayal of sound in the stillness. Inside, the trailer was a wound laid bare. Drawers hung open, their contents strewn like confetti. His meager pantry, cans of beans, a bag of rice, was gone. His tools, hard-earned and well-worn, had vanished. Even the flag, the one folded with reverence at Ellie's casket, was missing, its absence a violation that cut deeper than the rest. But when Ray's eyes fell on the shadow box, now empty, the black and silver patch gone, something shifted in him. Not rage, but a quiet, molten resolve. That patch wasn't just cloth. It was a symbol forged in blood, sweat, and unspoken vows. A piece of him, of the men he'd led, of the battles they'd carried home in their bones. When the sheriff arrived, his notepad ready and his questions gentle, Ray stood in the wreckage of his home, his face unreadable. The sheriff asked what he wanted back most, expecting a practical answer: food, tools, maybe the flag. But Ray's voice was steady, low, cutting through the air like a blade. "Just bring me the patch," he said. "It's not gold. It's not worth money. It's a piece of cloth earned in blood." The words hung there, simple but heavy, and the sheriff, a younger man who'd never seen war, felt the weight of them settle in his chest. He didn't know the half of it, but he nodded, scribbling the words as if they might unravel the mystery of the man before him. Word spread as it does in small towns, and soon the whispers reached men who hadn't heard Ray's name in decades. They were old now, like him, their bodies slower but their memories sharp. These were the men who'd followed Sergeant Marshall into the dark, through jungles, through firefights, through missions where survival was a gamble. They came out of retirement, not with fanfare but with a quiet purpose, converging on the town like ghosts called to a reckoning. They weren't just retrieving a patch. They were reclaiming a legacy, a bond forged in places the world forgot, a promise to a man who'd never left them behind. And Ray, standing in his violated home, felt the weight of their loyalty, a flicker of the fire he'd long since buried, stirring once more. The door, scarred and battered, creaked open with a groan that seemed to protest the intrusion. Ray Marshall stepped inside, and the sight that greeted him stole the air from his lungs. His home, his sanctuary, had been ravaged. Drawers were yanked from their places, their contents spilled across the floor like the guts of some wounded animal. Cabinets stood bare, their shelves stripped of everything: dishes, cans, even the old mugs he'd kept for years. The small kitchen table, where he'd sipped coffee and read the paper for decades, lay on its side, one leg bent at an unnatural angle. His mattress, slashed and gutted, slumped in a heap of torn fabric and splintered wood, the stuffing spilling out like snow. The old heater, a relic he'd relied on through countless winters, was gone. His toolbox, a weathered companion from the 1970s, filled with tools that bore the marks of his hands, was missing. Even the small tin behind the sink, where he stashed a modest roll of cash, had vanished. But none of that hit him as hard as the sight of the far wall. His chest tightened, not from the loss of possessions, but from the violation of something far more sacred. The wall was naked, stripped of the shadow box that had hung there for years. The rusted nails, crooked and stubborn, jutted out like silent accusations. But the box itself, the heart of his home, was gone. Ray's knees felt weak as he stepped forward, each footfall heavier than the last, as if the weight of memory dragged him down. That shadow box wasn't just wood and glass. It held the flag Ellie, his late wife, had folded with trembling hands after his return from the jungle, her eyes brimming with pride and relief. It cradled the bronze star, its edges worn from years of quiet reverence. There was the faded photograph, creased and yellowed, of him and his unit in the dense green hell of Vietnam, their faces grim but alive. And at the center, the black and silver delta patch, simple, unadorned, yet heavier than any metal. It was gone. Ray's hands curled into fists, not out of anger, but from a hollow ache that clawed at his core. That patch wasn't for display, not something to brag about at the VFW over beers. It was a secret shared only by those who understood its weight. Black cloth, silver stitching, no name, no rank, just a symbol that spoke volumes to the few who'd earned it. He could still feel the moment it was pressed into his palm in a jungle clearing at dawn, after a mission no official report would ever acknowledge. The air had been thick with the smell of damp earth and gunpowder, the silence heavy with the absence of men who hadn't made it back. The patch wasn't a decoration, it was a bond forged in blood, a quiet testament to the brothers who'd stood beside him, and the ones who never left that jungle. Now some thief, some fool who saw it as nothing more than a shiny trinket, had taken it. The thought twisted in Ray's gut like a knife, not because of the theft, but because of the ignorance behind it. Whoever had it didn't know the cost of that patch, didn't know the names it carried, the lives it honored. He sank onto the edge of what remained of his couch, its frame sagging under his weight. His eyes drifted over the wreckage of his home, but they kept returning to that bare wall. His history, his life lay in ruins around him, but it was the absence of that patch that cut the deepest. It was the only proof that those men, his men, had existed, that their sacrifice had meant something. Ray sat there lost in the silence, his mind wandering to the faces in that old photograph. He could still hear their voices, their laughter, the way they'd teased each other to keep the fear at bay. He could still see Ellie's hands, steady and gentle, folding that flag with care, her way of saying she understood what he'd carried home. The patch had been his anchor, a reminder that he'd been part of something bigger than himself, something that mattered. Now it was gone, and with it, a piece of his soul. After a long while, Ray reached for the rotary phone still mounted on the wall. Miraculously, it hadn't been touched, its black plastic casing a stubborn survivor amidst the chaos. His fingers, steady despite the storm inside him, dialed the number for the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office. Lincoln County Sheriff's Office, a voice answered, clipped and professional. "Yeah, Ray Marshall," he said, his voice low but firm. "I need someone out here. Been robbed." The deputy on the other end took down his information with the bored efficiency of someone used to such calls. They promised to send someone by before dark if possible. Ray didn't argue or press, he just hung up and waited, his gaze drifting back to the empty wall. The minutes stretched into an hour, and he sat there motionless, the weight of loss settling deeper into his bones. A dusty cruiser finally pulled up outside, its tires crunching on the gravel. Sheriff Hal Cutter stepped out, his boots kicking up small clouds of dirt. Hal was in his late 50s, soft around the middle, with the kind of easygoing demeanor that made him a decent man, but not exactly a bloodhound. He'd been elected 3 terms in a row, more for his likability than his tenacity. Inside the trailer, Hal moved slowly, his eyes sweeping over the destruction with the practiced detachment of someone who'd seen too many break-ins. "Damn shame," he muttered, shaking his head. "Kids, maybe. Could be drugs. There's been a ring hitting these back roads lately." Ray didn't respond, just watched as Hal scribbled notes in a worn leather notebook. The sheriff's pen scratched against the paper, a sound that felt too small for the magnitude of what had happened here. "You missing anything valuable?" Hal asked, glancing up. Ray nodded toward the bare wall. "Shadow box, flag, medals, a patch." Hal's eyes followed Ray's gesture, lingering on the crooked nails. "A patch?" he asked, one brow raised, as if trying to gauge the significance. Ray's jaw tightened, a flicker of something raw passing through his eyes. Black cloth, silver thread, centerpiece of the box. The sheriff paused, his pen hovering over the notebook. He didn't get it. Ray could see that in the slight tilt of his head, the polite but blank expression. "So, like a patch?" Hal ventured, his tone careful. Ray didn't blink. "It was earned," he said, his voice steady but laced with something unyielding. "I want it back." There was a moment of silence, heavy and awkward. Hal nodded slowly, scribbling something down, though it was clear he didn't grasp the weight of what Ray was saying. "Right," he said. "We'll put it on the list. I'll check with pawn shops, file the report." Ray just nodded, his expression unreadable. As Hal turned to leave, he hesitated at the door, his hand resting on the frame. "Look, Ray," he said, his voice softer now. "I know that stuff means a lot to you, and I'm not saying we won't try, but—" "Don't!" Ray cut him off, his eyes locking onto Hal's. The word wasn't sharp, but it carried a quiet finality that stopped the sheriff in his tracks. Hal nodded again, chastened. "Right. We'll do what we can." And then he was gone, the cruiser's engine fading into the distance. leaving only a trail of dust behind. Ray sat there long after the sheriff left, the silence of the trailer wrapping around him like a shroud. He didn't cry or curse. He didn't have it in him. Instead, he sat in the stillness, one hand resting on the wall where the shadow box had hung, the other clenched loosely at his side. The patch wasn't just cloth, it was memory, brotherhood, blood. It was the only tangible proof that the men who never came home had existed, that their lives had mattered, that he had been part of something greater than himself. Now it was out there in the hands of someone who didn't know its worth, or worse, someone who didn't care. For years, Ray had lived quietly, letting the memories fade into the corners of his mind. They didn't demand attention anymore. They simply waited, patient and heavy. But now, with that patch gone, they stirred again, whispering names and faces he'd tried to keep at bay. He didn't know if he'd ever get it back, but sitting there in the ruins of his home, he knew one thing. That patch was more than a thing. It was the last piece of a life he'd left behind, and he wasn't ready to let it go. In the stillness of his small Arkansas home, Ray sat on the edge of his worn-out bed, staring at the blank wall where his shadow box once hung. The absence of the black and silver patch gnawed at him, stirring memories he'd long kept buried, like ghosts rising under a frostbitten moon. For 40 years, he'd carried the weight of those memories in silence, but their theft ripped open wounds he thought had scarred over. The patch wasn't just fabric. It was a tether to a past soaked in blood, rain, and loss, a reminder of a mission that had carved itself into his soul. To the folks in town, he was Quiet Ray, a man whose voice never rose above a low murmur, whose temper seemed as steady as the oak trees lining the county road. They saw a lean figure in faded flannel, always polite, always distant, tending to his garden or fixing a neighbor's fence without asking for a dime. But they didn't know the Ray of 1978, the one who led 6 men into a jungle inferno in Central America, a place where only 4 returned. That Ray was a phantom, locked away in the recesses of his mind, surfacing only when the world grew too quiet or the nightmares grew too loud. Back then, the mission had sounded straightforward. A Black Ops recon job, no flags, no dog tags, just deniability. The CIA needed eyes on a cartel compound hidden deep in the jungles, a fortress carved into a limestone ridge, bristling with guards, tripwires, and sharpened bamboo stakes. Inside were 3 Americans, 2 DEA agents and a journalist missing for over 8 months. The intel was shaky, a gamble at best, but Ray's unit, the Ghost Hawks, was built for jobs no one else dared touch. They were a tight-knit crew: Barnes, Keegan, Lazo, Wheeler, Mendoza, and Cho, each man a specialist in his own right, each one trusting Ray to lead them through the impossible. Ray could still recall the jungle's suffocating grip, the stench of wet earth, gasoline, and blood mingling in the air. They'd moved under the cover of a monsoon, scaling the eastern rock wall in near silence, their boots sinking into the mud as rain lashed their faces. Every step was deliberate, every breath measured. Ray's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing 6 lives hung on his decisions. The breach went smoothly, their knives and suppressed rifles cutting through the outer defenses like a whisper. But the extraction was a different beast. It started with a child's scream, a piercing cry that shattered the night and unleashed chaos. Gunfire erupted from 3 sides, muzzle flashes lighting up the jungle like fireflies gone mad. Mendoza took shrapnel to the leg, collapsing with a grunt of pain, his face twisted in defiance as he waved Ray off. "Go, leave me," he shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. Wheeler was next, a bullet tearing through his gut, his bod sagging against Ray as he whispered, "Tell my kid I tried." The words lodged in Ray's chest like shrapnel of their own, a promise he'd carry for decades. Ray didn't think, he acted. Scooping Mendoza onto his shoulder, he fired with his free hand, his arm burning from the recoil. Bullets whizzed past, snapping branches and kicking up mud, but Ray pushed forward, his boots slogging through the riverbed that guided their escape. A bullet grazed his upper arm, sending a jolt of fire through his body, but he didn't falter. The pain was secondary. His men were not. Half a mile later, soaked in rain and blood, He collapsed at the rendezvous point too, his vision blurring as he refused the medevac until every surviving man was loaded first. There were no parades for that mission, no medals pinned to his chest. The op vanished into a maze of redacted files, its existence denied by men in suits who'd never seen the jungle's teeth. A month later, in a dimly lit room at Fort Bragg, Ray's former CO handed him a black patch with silver embroidery, its minimalist design stark against the weight it carried. "Only 6 men in the country wear this," the colonel said, his voice low. "Now it's 7. You earned it the hard way." Ray accepted it without a word, his fingers tracing the stitching as if it could hold the fragments of that night together. He never wore the patch, never showed it to Ellie, the woman who'd shared his life until cancer took her too soon. Instead, he framed it behind glass, flanked by faded photos of his team and a compass that had guided them through the dark. It wasn't a trophy, it was a memorial. Every glance at it brought back the jungle's roar, the faces of Barnes and Cho, men who'd never see another sunrise. It reminded him of the cost of survival, the guilt of being the one who made it home. Now, with the patch gone, stolen in a senseless break-in, those memories surged back with a vengeance. Sitting on his bed, Ray felt the weight of 40 years collapse into a single moment. He could hear Mendoza's desperate shouts, feel Wheeler's fading grip, smell the rain-soaked earth. The voices of his fallen brothers hadn't faded. They'd only grown quieter, waiting for a trigger to rise again. Ray's hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the rawness of it all, the sense that a piece of his soul had been ripped away. Ray never sought recognition. He avoided Legion halls, skipped Veterans Day parades, let his service fade into the scars etched across his body, and the silence he wore like armor. The town knew him as the man who fixed things, lawnmowers, fences, lives, but never asked for thanks. His heroism was private, stitched into the fabric of his being, not something to be waved like a flag. A few days after the theft, Ray sat on his porch, nursing weak coffee from a chipped mug that had seen better days. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp soil. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path, and Ray looked up to see Ben, the lanky 19-year-old from the house over the ridge. Ben's boots were too new, his National Guard uniform still stiff with pride. Ray had fixed the kid's lawnmower once, refusing payment with a wave of his hand, and Ben had looked at him with a mix of awe and curiosity ever since. "Mr. Ray," Ben said, his voice soft as he stopped just shy of the porch steps. He shifted his weight, nervous but determined. Ray's eyes lifted from his coffee, meeting the boy's gaze. I heard about what happened. My grandpa told me." Ben hesitated, then pressed on. "Said they took some kind of patch." Ray gave a small nod, his face unreadable, but his heart twisting at the mention. The patch wasn't just a thing, it was a piece of him, a thread connecting him to the men he'd failed to bring home. Ben's words hung in the air, and Ray felt the weight of the past settle over him once more, as heavy as the jungle rain. Ben's eyes were heavy, shadowed by exhaustion that clung to him like damp clothes after a long march. He stood on Ray's weathered porch, the gravel crunching under his boots as he shifted uncomfortably, the late afternoon humidity pressing against his skin. His throat tightened with a mix of guilt and curiosity, as if he were trespassing on sacred ground just by asking. "Was it important?" he said, his voice low, hesitant, like a soldier stepping carefully through a minefield, knowing the answer but needing to hear it from Ray himself. Ray's gaze locked onto his, steady and unyielding, like a man who'd faced down death and come out the other side. There was no anger in his eyes, no flare of dramatics, just a quiet, ancient stillness, a weight that seemed to carry the echoes of forgotten battles and buried friends. "Let's just say it didn't belong to them," Ray said, his voice calm but threaded with something deep, something that made Ben feel like he was standing before a monument, etched with names too heavy to speak. Ben nodded, sensing the door to the conversation had closed. He turned and walked away, Ray's words settling into his chest like a stone, heavy with meaning he couldn't fully grasp. That night, in the dim glow of his small apartment, Ben sat at his desk, the silence pressing in around him. The world outside was still, save for the occasional hum of a passing car. His laptop screen cast a pale light across his face as he opened it, his fingers hovering over the keys with a mix of purpose and reluctance. Ben wasn't one for social media. The endless noise of it grated on him, the posturing and pretense of people who'd never known real stakes. But there was one place he belonged, a private online forum for veterans, a digital sanctuary where men and women, young and old, gathered to share stories, swap job leads, or sometimes just unburden themselves of memories that refused to stay buried. It was a sacred space, fiercely guarded. Stolen valor earned you a swift ban, no questions asked. Every war from Vietnam to Kandahar had a voice there, someone who'd carried a rifle or a med kit through the chaos and lived to carry the weight of it afterward. He typed slowly, each word chosen with care, as if he were carving them into stone. An elder vet near me got robbed. Trailer gutted. Didn't ask for help. Just wants a black and silver Delta patch back. Says it was earned. He's quiet, doesn't brag. Anyone heard of something like this? He hit send, watching the message vanish into the void of the internet. It wasn't a plea or a call to arms, just a statement, plain and true, like Ray himself. Ben leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen, a flicker of doubt creeping in. Would anyone even see it? The thread didn't explode with replies. It didn't go viral, didn't need to, but it found its way to the right eyes, like a signal flare cutting through the dark. 6 days later, the crunch of tires on gravel shattered the stillness of Ray's property. A black SUV, its windows tinted dark as midnight, rolled slowly up the Ray's driveway. It paused, idling, the low hum of its engine blending with the distant chirp of crickets. Ray was out front, kneeling in the dirt, his hands caked with soil as he coaxed life from what remained of his garden. His back was bent, not just from age, but from years of carrying burdens most would never understand. There was a quiet determination in the way he worked, as if the earth itself owed him something for all it had taken. He glanced up, squinting against the late afternoon sun that glinted off the SUV's hood. Slowly he straightened, wiping his hands on his worn jeans, his eyes narrowing as the driver's door opened. The man who stepped out moved with a precision that time hadn't dulled. Tall, broad-shouldered, he carried himself like an officer, even without the uniform. His hair was silver now, clipped, short and neat, but his eyes, sharp and piercing, burned with the same intensity they always had. Ray's voice was flat, almost resigned as he spoke, the name heavy with the weight of years. "Colonel Divers," he said, a flicker of something, recognition, maybe regret, crossing his weathered face. "Didn't expect to see you again." Divers stepped forward, his boots steady on the uneven ground, his presence commanding despite the years that had passed. "Didn't think I'd have to show up," he replied, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had once steadied men in the chaos of battle. He extended a hand, and Ray clasped it, their grip firm, a silent acknowledgement of a bond forged in blood and fire, in places where words like honor and duty weren't just ideals but lifelines. "But then I heard someone took your patch." Ray's jaw tightened just for a moment, and he nodded, the motion small but heavy with meaning. "That's right," he said, his voice steady but laced with a quiet pain, like a wound that had never fully healed. Divers exhaled, a long, deliberate breath, his eyes sweeping over the broken-down trailer behind Ray, the sagging porch rail, the dented mailbox, the faint scars of a life lived on the edge of survival. Then he looked back at Ray, his gaze unwavering, like a man who'd seen too much to flinch. "That's not going to stand," he said, his tone matter-of-fact as if he were stating a law of nature. "I made a call. Couple of guys owe you. Some of them never paid it back. Figured they'd like the chance to make it right." Ray didn't ask who. He didn't need to. His silence was enough, a quiet acceptance that spoke louder than any question could. Divers reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small notepad, its pages worn and scribbled with a few names in sharp, precise handwriting. "They're already sniffing around," he said, his voice staid, but carrying a hint of the old fire. "Couple of pawn shops in Tennessee, a collector in Virginia. Nothing yet, but we'll find it." Ray nodded once, a single deliberate motion, his eyes flickering with something that might have been gratitude, or maybe just recognition. That was all he needed to say. The two men stood there, the silence stretching between them, heavy with the weight of a shared past. Missions gone wrong, men lost, promises kept in the face of impossible odds. Words weren't necessary. They'd seen too much together, carried too many of the same ghosts to bother with small talk. Then Diver spoke again, his voice softer but no less resolute. This isn't just about a patch, Ray. You know that. Ray's eyes drifted to the horizon where the sun was sinking low, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. For a moment he seemed far away, lost in a memory of jungles and gunfire, of brothers who never made it home. Yeah, he said quietly, almost to himself. I do. Because it wasn't just a piece of fabric that had been taken. It was a fragment of something sacred, a brotherhood forged in the crucible of sacrifice, a memory of nights spent under a sky lit by tracer rounds, a symbol of what it cost to come home when others didn't. Someone out there had touched it, not knowing the weight of what they held, and that ignorance was an insult Ray couldn't let stand. It wasn't about pride or possession. It was about the men who'd worn that patch, the ones who'd paid for it with their blood, and the ones who still carried its weight in their souls. The patch didn't turn up right away. It didn't appear on eBay or in the dusty glass cases of local pawn shops, where forgotten trinkets gathered dust alongside old guitars and tarnished jewelry. No petty thief flaunted it on social media. No collector bragged about it in some obscure online marketplace. Whoever had taken it likely didn't understand its value, or maybe they did, and that made the theft all the more egregious, a deliberate desecration of something sacred. But the men searching for it weren't the kind to give up easily, nor were they the kind to ask twice. Diver's single phone call had set something in motion, a ripple through a network that existed only in the shadows, old unit chats that buzzed with coded messages, encrypted email threads that carried more weight than most military briefings, backyard cookouts where retired snipers flipped burgers with one eye on the horizon, and former medics still kept trauma kits tucked in the trunks of their sedans. From Memphis pawn shops to veteran bars in Roanoke, the word spread like wildfire. Someone stole Ray Marshall's patch. Black and silver. Delta. Return it, or someone's coming for it. Those who remembered the ghost hawks knew the description immediately. Some thought the men from that unit were long gone, faded into legend, or lost to time, their stories buried with them. Others knew better. You don't forget the man who carried 2 wounded soldiers out of a jungle, his own arm torn open, blood soaking his sleeve as he refused to stop. You don't forget the man who stood his ground, refusing a medevac until every last one of his team was safe, their lives placed above his own. By the end of the week, the whispers had grown louder, the network tightening like a noose. The old guard was stirring, their resolve as sharp as ever, and they were coming. The tip had come through a hushed network of collectors along the East Coast, a whisper about a man named Eli, who was flaunting rare military relics that had no business being in private hands. Word was he'd been showing off something peculiar, a patch, stark black with silver threads woven into precise, elegant lines. No unit insignia, no country's name, just an enigmatic design that radiated a quiet menace. It was the kind of thing that made old soldiers pause, their eyes narrowing as the memories they'd buried stirred to life. That patch alone was enough to pull 3 men from their quiet lives, two from Georgia, one from upstate New York. Each was well past 60, their hair thinned or grayed, their joints stiff from years of hard service. Yet they still laced up their worn combat boots, moved with the steady purpose of younger days, and spoke of Ray as Sarge, even though he was hundreds of miles away, unaware of their mission. Their hunt crisscrossed state lines driven by a loyalty that time hadn't dulled. Meanwhile, in a small Arkansas town, Ray Marshall carried on with his routine, untouched by the search unfolding far to the east. His days were simple, deliberate. He tended his garden, coaxing life from the soil with a patience that seemed to steady the world around him. He watered his tomatoes, their leaves glistening under the morning sun, and checked on Mrs. Penner's dog, a scruffy mutt that wagged its tail furiously at the sight of him. Every morning he walked 2 miles to Jake's diner, his limp barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. He didn't ask for updates about the missing shadow box or the patch it once held. He didn't pace his porch or dwell on what was lost. Ray just kept moving forward, as he always had, his quiet strength a constant in a town that had long taken him for granted. But something was shifting. It started with a stranger, a man in his 40s, hair cropped close, a slight limp mirroring Ray's own. He pulled his truck to a stop in front of Ray's modest home, the engine idling as he sat for a long moment, staring at the neatly trimmed lawn. Finally, he stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached. His handshake was firm, almost reverent. "Are you Sergeant Ray Marshall?" he asked, his voice catching. Ray squinted, his weathered face unreadable. "Used to be," he replied softly. The man's eyes glistened as he spoke again, his words heavy with gratitude. "My brother was Wheeler. You carried him." The memory hung between them, unspoken but vivid. Ray didn't respond, just gave a single nod, his jaw tight. The man left a brown paper bag filled with groceries on the porch and walked away, his shoulders shaking as he fought back tears. The next day, a woman from the post office arrived with a handwritten note, slipped into an envelope with no return address. Inside was a $50 gas card in 4 words scrawled in careful script. "We haven't forgotten you." By week's end, Ray's porch was crowded with gifts. 3 apple pies, their crusts golden and fragrant, and 2 tins of coffee, the kind he liked best, and enough canned soup to see him through the winter. At first, Ray thought it was a passing gesture, a fleeting wave of kindness. But the visits didn't stop. Each day brought someone new. Veterans he didn't know, their faces lined with stories they'd never shared, clasped his hand with quiet respect. Teenage boys in ROTC shirts stood tall, their voices cracking as they thanked him for things they barely understood. Elderly women, their memories sparked by half-forgotten news clippings from the 1970s, brought blankets and home-cooked meals, their eyes soft with admiration. One man delivered a bag of dog food for Mrs. Penner's mutt. Another replaced Ray's stolen American flag with a new one, its stars crisp against the red and white stripes. Ray didn't know how to respond to the outpouring. Words had never been his strength, so he nodded, shook hands, and returned to his tasks, pruning, painting, fixing whatever needed mending. But inside, the weight of their gratitude pressed against him, stirring emotions he'd long kept locked away. He felt the eyes of the town on him now, not with pity, but with something deeper. Respect, awe, a recognition that had been absent for decades. People who once passed him without a glance now stopped to wave. Jake's Diner hung a new sign. "Coffee is always free for Quiet Ray." The sheriff, who'd once dismissed Ray's report about the stolen flag, now drove by twice a day, his patrol car slowing as if to pay silent tribute. It wasn't just kindness, it was a reckoning. The town began to piece together Ray's story, not from him, he never spoke of his past, but from fragments shared in hushed conversations. At the feed store, a local vet who'd served in Panama recalled the black patch with silver threads, his voice low with reverence. The retired high school principal, a man who'd always kept Ray's secret, admitted he'd known the truth but had been sworn to silence. Bit by bit, the whispers formed a picture. Ray Marshall wasn't just the polite old man with a limp and a soft voice. He was a hero, a man who'd carried out missions that never made the news, who'd saved lives at a cost he'd never named. The town, which had once seen him as part of the scenery, now realized they'd been living alongside a legend. And Ray, who'd never once sought recognition, seemed to carry the weight of their newfound reverence with the same quiet grace he'd always shown. Far away on a gray Saturday morning in Richmond, Virginia, the patch resurfaced. The private military memorabilia show filled a sprawling conference center, its halls buzzing with collectors, hobbyists, and veterans. Glass cases gleamed with artifacts, Civil War buttons, Vietnam-era flak jackets, medals pinned to velvet. Most attendees were there for history, for the thrill of touching the past. But in a dim corner, behind a table cluttered with shadow boxes and framed medals, sat Eli Carroll. He wasn't in uniform, but something about him felt wrong, too polished, too eager, his smile a little too sharp. He spoke quickly, naming prices for items that should never have been for sale, his hands moving with a salesman's flourish. Propped beside a World War II helmet in a pristine display case lined with black velvet was the patch. Black with silver threads woven into clean, lethal lines. To most, it was just a curiosity, a nameless relic. But to the three men who tracked it across state lines, it was everything. A symbol of sacrifice, of secrets kept, of a bond forged in fire. As they closed in, their boots silent on the conference center floor, the weight of their mission settled over them, as heavy and unyielding as the past they carried. The moment Colonel Mike Devers crossed the threshold of the dimly lit antique shop, his eyes locked onto it, a small, weathered patch displayed unceremoniously on a cluttered table. It wasn't just fabric and thread to him. It was a fragment of a life he'd lived, a silent testament to sacrifices buried in the shadows of memory. His heart tightened, a familiar ache stirring beneath his stoic exterior. He hadn't come alone. Flanking him were Davis and Lazo, men forged in the same crucible of covert operations, their presence as deliberate as the mission they'd undertaken today. They weren't in uniform, jeans, faded jackets, and boots scuffed from years of use, but their movements betrayed a discipline that time couldn't erase. Davis, a towering figure from Tennessee, carried himself with the quiet strength of a man who once hauled an M60 and 2 radios through jungles without complaint. His broad shoulders seemed to bear the weight of those years, his eyes heavy with unspoken stories. Lazo, lean and wiry, moved with the restless vigilance of someone always anticipating the next threat, his gaze darting across the room, cataloging exits and faces. They were civilians now, or so their clothes claimed, but the past clung to them like dust on their boots. Devers didn't speak at first. He stood back, letting the shop's owner, Carroll, finish his pitch to another customer. The colonel's silence wasn't hesitation. It was strategy, a pause to measure the man who stood between him and that patch. When Carroll turned, his salesman's smile faltered under Devers's unyielding stare. The patch lay between them, its black and silver threads catching the faint light, whispering of missions no one spoke of aloud. "That's not for sale," Carroll said, his voice flat but edged with unease, sensing the weight of Devers's interest. "No," Devers replied, his tone low, deliberate, like a blade sliding from its sheath. "It's not yours to sell." The words carried a quiet menace, not born of anger but of certainty. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a reckoning. Carroll's lips curled into a smirk, a weak attempt to reclaim control. "Well, it's mine now. Bought it fair and square from a guy in Arkansas. Cash deal." His bravado rang hollow, a thin shield against the three men who now closed in, their presence filling the room like a gathering storm. Lazo stepped forward, his lean frame taut with restrained intensity, his eyes sharp as ever, fixed on Carroll. "That patch wasn't made for flea markets," he said, his voice soft but cutting. "Only 7 were ever issued. 7 men earned them. You're holding stolen history." Carroll's eyebrow arched, a flicker of defiance. "That's so," he said, trying to keep his tone light. "Well, everything here's legal. You can't prove otherwise." Davis, usually silent, spoke now, his deep voice steady as granite. "You're holding the 7th," he said, his words carrying the weight of truth no one could mistake. The air grew heavier, Carroll's forced chuckle drying up in his throat. He glanced at the patch, then back at the men, his confidence unraveling. He didn't know the full story, but he sensed he'd stumbled into something far bigger than a shady deal. Devers leaned closer, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper, colder than rage, sharper than grief. "That patch was earned in blood, in silence, on missions you'll never understand. You're standing on a line you can't even see." His eyes held Carroll's, unblinking, and in that moment, the shopkeeper saw something that made his bravado crumble. A glimpse of the pad behind the patch, of lives lost, of promises kept in the dark. Carroll's gaze darted to the exit, a reflex born of instinct, but it was too late. From the crowd, 2 men in suits emerged, their movements precise, their faces unreadable. They didn't need to flash badges or raise their voices. Federal agents, clean-cut and quiet. They approached with the calm assurance of men who'd been watching for months. One nodded to Devers, the other whispered something to Carroll, whose face drained of color. The patch, it turned out, was just the tip of a much darker iceberg. Carroll wasn't just a small-time hustler peddling trinkets. He was entangled in a multi-state trafficking ring, dealing in stolen military artifacts, Medals, patches, and keepsakes lifted from the estates of elderly veterans or swiped from active duty bases. The feds had been closing in, waiting for a clear link to tie him to the operation. That patch, with its undeniable provenance, was the final piece. 20 minutes later, Carroll was escorted out, his hands cuffed, his protest swallowed by the silence of the shop. The patch remained in its case, untouched, a relic of honor amid the clutter of greed. Devers lifted it carefully, his fingers tracing the stitching, the faint wear on one corner, where it had once brushed against jungle webbing or a field jacket. To him, it wasn't just fabric, it was a brother's laughter, a shared cigarette in the rain, a mission no one would ever know. His chest tightened, not with triumph, but with the weight of memory. Davis and Lazo stood at his side, their silence a shared reverence. What could you say when you held something that carried the souls of the lost? The echoes of missions buried deep. You didn't celebrate, you just breathed, and you carried on. The sun was dipping low, painting the evening sky in hues of golden orange, when Ray heard the familiar crunch of gravel outside his trailer. The sound stirred something in him, a quiet certainty that didn't need confirmation. He didn't bother glancing out the window. Somehow he knew who it was. Wiping his hands on a faded cloth from the garden, he stepped onto the porch, the air thick with the scent of fresh-cut hay and the faint smokiness of a neighbor's charcoal grill. Small-town evenings had a way of wrapping you in their simplicity, but tonight felt different, heavier, like the world was holding its breath. A black SUV rolled to a stop, its engine idling briefly before falling silent. Colonel Mike Devers stepped out, his face etched with the same resolve Ray remembered from years ago, though time had softened the edges. Davis followed, his broad frame moving slower now, a cane in his hand where once he'd carried the weight of war. Lazo was next, his lean figure marked by a slight limp, but his posture still proud, unyielding. Behind them, a second vehicle emptied its passengers. 3 men, each carrying the marks of their own battles. One wore a Vietnam-era watch cap, his eyes distant but kind. Another had a prosthetic hand, its polished surface catching the fading light. The third clutched a photograph under his arm, its edges worn from years of being held, remembered. No one spoke as they approached Ray's porch, their footsteps steady on the gravel. Devers stopped in front of him, his expression unreadable but soft, almost tender. He opened a small box lined with soft cloth, revealing the patch, black and silver, worn in all the right places, a piece of their shared past. Ray's breath caught, his eyes misting but steady as he recognized it instantly. It wasn't just his, it was theirs, a symbol of who they'd been, of the brotherhood forged in moments of terror and triumph no one else could understand. Devers didn't offer a speech. He didn't need to. "We got it," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion he'd never voice aloud. Ray stared at the patch, his heart a tangle of pride and grief. Memories flooded him, nights under starless skies, the weight of a rifle in his hands, the faces of men who never came home. Slowly he reached out, his hands steady but reverent, as if lifting something fragile, sacred. He took the patch, holding it like it might shatter, like it carried the weight of every promise they'd made to each other. He didn't say thank you. Words felt too small for this. Instead, he met Devers' eyes, then Davis, Lazo's, and the others. A silent acknowledgement of what they'd done, of what they'd always do for each other. The sun sank lower, the world quiet except for the distant hum of cicadas. They stood together, bound by something stronger than time, and then, without a word, they turned to go. The patch was home, and so were they. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, bathing the uneven grass beside Ray Marshall's trailer in a soft, golden light. It was a hushed Sunday morning, the kind where the world seemed to pause, sensing the gravity of what was about to unfold. No news vans crowded the scene, no camera shutters clicked, no ornate podium awaited a speaker. Just a scattering of folding chairs on the lawn and a small crowd of perhaps 24 people, each carrying the weight of this moment in their hearts. Neighbors arrived quietly, their expressions tender with reverence. The local sheriff stood at the rear, his hat pressed to his chest, his gaze lowered in quiet respect. Staff from the VA clinic set up folding tables, offering coffee and paper cups, their movements practiced and purposeful, born of a deep understanding of service. A few veterans from distant towns, their steps slowed by time and injury, leaned on canes and walkers, yet they'd driven hours to be here, compelled by a bond stronger than words. Ray stood on his porch, his pulse quickening in a way it hadn't in years. He wore no military garb, no decorations, just a neatly pressed button-down, jeans, and boots he'd shined meticulously the night before, each brushstroke a quiet reflection on his past. In his hands, he held an American flag, folded into a crisp triangle, its edges sharp with care. And as he approached the flagpole, his steps were deliberate, each one echoing with memories of jungles, deserts, and battlefields where he'd led men through fire and fear. The crowd watched in reverent silence, their breath soft as Ray began to raise the flag. Halfway up, a breeze caught it, unfurling its stars and stripes against the vast blue sky. By the time it reached the top, it waved with quiet dignity, a testament to something unbroken in the man who raised it. Next to the pole, fastened once more to the porch wall, was the shadow box. Inside, the patch, the one stolen, the one that had nearly shattered him, was restored to its place, centered behind glass. It wasn't there for pride or proof. It was there for memory, for the men who'd worn that patch beside him, for the vows they'd sworn in the crucible of war. Ray stepped back, his posture rigid with respect, and stood at attention. His eyes followed the flag's gentle sway, and for a fleeting moment, he was back in those jungles, the crack of gunfire in his ears, the weight of leadership on his shoulders. But today there was only stillness, no commands to issue, just the quiet presence of a community that understood the load he'd borne. One by one, the men who'd served under him, those who'd followed him through the chaos of war, stepped forward. Their faces were etched with time. Their hands shook faintly, but their eyes held the same fierce loyalty they'd shared decades ago. Each carried a small offering, a note, its paper softened from years in a wallet, a photograph faded but alive with the laughter of youth, an old compass that had guided them through endless nights, a spent rifle casing, its brass worn but heavy with history. These were more than objects. They were fragments of their shared soul, tokens of a brotherhood forged in survival. As they placed them in Ray's hands, their fingers grazed his, and in those brief touches, unspoken debts were settled, silences honored, burdens shared. For the first time in decades, Ray didn't feel like the last man left. The crushing weight of being the sole keeper of their memories lifted as these men stood before him. Each token was a lifeline, a reminder that he wasn't alone, that the brotherhood endured beyond the battlefield. His heart swelled, not with sorrow but with a gratitude so profound it nearly undid him. He met their gazes and saw not just soldiers but brothers who'd carried the same guilt, pride, and quiet ache he had. No words were needed. Their presence spoke volumes. As the sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet, the men formed a loose half-circle beneath the flagpole. No one saluted, no one spoke. They stood, heads bowed, hats in hand, their silence a tribute louder than any anthem. The moment needed no fanfare, no amplification. It needed only their presence, their shared stillness, their unwavering devotion to a man who'd led them through the darkest days. Ray's eyes drifted to the shadow box, now holding not just the patch, but the tokens his brothers had entrusted to him. Each was a piece of evidence that he hadn't been forgotten, that the brotherhood stood firm. That night, under a sky scattered with stars, Ray sat alone in his living room, the shadow box glowing faintly in the lamplight. His fingers traced the glass, pausing over the patch at its center. For years, he'd felt like a specter, haunted by the men he'd lost, the wars he'd survived, the life he'd left behind. But now, something had changed. The tokens in the box weren't mere objects. They were anchors, tethering him to the truth that he was still part of something greater. The thieves who'd taken his belongings, who tried to steal that small piece of cloth, had unknowingly roused a force beyond their understanding. They'd awakened a brotherhood that refused to let Ray Marshall fade away.